You think you're making your own choices. You choose what to wear, what to study, who to love, what kind of life to chase. But have you ever wondered where those choices came from? Not in the obvious sense, not peer pressure, not an ad on your phone. I'm talking about something quieter, something older, invisible. The beliefs that shaped your childhood. The stories your culture whispered before you knew how to speak. The rules of what's normal, worthy, successful, that you never wrote, but somehow follow. They're not obvious. That's what makes them powerful. Because when something's invisible long enough, it starts to feel like truth. What if your deepest ambitions, the battles you're fighting, even your sense of who you are, weren't fully yours? What if you're not lost? You're just following a map someone else drew without your permission. Today, we're going to trace those hidden lines, to uncover the scripts quietly steering your life, and ask the question most people never dare. Is this truly mine, or just inherited? There's a strange kind of tension many of us carry, an inner dissonance that's hard to name. You're doing everything right, checking off boxes that were handed to you long ago, and yet, a quiet part of you wonders why it doesn't feel like enough. This unease often points to something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of our daily choices, invisible scripts. These scripts are not instructions written in a manual or imposed through loud declarations. They are silent beliefs, deeply embedded patterns that shape how you think, feel, and act, often without your conscious permission. They operate like an inner narrator, whispering what's appropriate, what's desirable, what's possible, long before you're old enough to ask who's speaking. You rarely question them, not because you agree with them, but because they've always been there. They don't shout, they hum beneath the noise, blending into the rhythm of your life until they feel like your own thoughts. From a young age, you absorb these scripts through the people closest to you, not necessarily through harsh rules or rigid expectations, but through glances, silences, tones of approval and disapproval. A father doesn't say, "Don't cry." He simply stiffens when you do. A mother doesn't command, "Be perfect." She just smiles wider when you get things right, and sighs a little when you don't. Over time, you start to build conclusions. That love is conditional, that productivity equals worth, that questioning authority is dangerous, that being different makes you less valuable. These beliefs, once internalized, become part of your architecture. You start to pursue things not because they're meaningful to you, but because they align with a script you never consciously chose. It's why some people chase careers they don't enjoy, stay in relationships that quietly suffocate them, or strive endlessly without knowing what they're striving for, not because they're lost, but because they're following a map, one drawn by others, passed down invisibly through generations. And the more invisible the script, the more power it holds, because when something goes unquestioned long enough, it stops feeling like belief and starts feeling like truth. That's the danger. You don't say, "I was told I should always achieve." You just feel anxious when you rest. You don't declare, "I think love must be earned." You simply flinch when someone offers it freely. And this is where the tension comes from, the friction between who you truly are and who you've been told to be. When these two selves drift too far apart, something inside begins to ache, not loudly but persistently. Yet most people never trace that ache back to the script. They blame themselves. They assume they're broken, unmotivated, or ungrateful. They don't realize they're living a life written by someone else's pen. But once you recognize that these scripts exist and that they were installed without your consent, you open a door to something powerful: choice. Because you can't rewrite a story you've never read. But once you see the script clearly, line by line, you can begin to decide what stays and what must be left behind. And that process, The slow excavation of belief is where true freedom begins. But before we can rewrite anything, we need to understand how these scripts got inside us in the first place. Let's look at the subtle, often invisible ways they are implanted, and why we rarely notice until it's too late. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, that so much of who we think we are was shaped in rooms we don't remember, by people who were just repeating scripts of their own. It's not about blame, it's about recognition, because until we see the invisible architecture behind our thoughts, we remain prisoners of its design. We follow paths that were never meant for us, chase definitions of success that quietly exhaust us, and wonder why we feel disconnected, when the truth is, we've never truly met ourselves outside the script. But once you begin to sense that these invisible scripts are guiding your life, the natural question arises, how did they get there? And why didn't you notice? Because no one hands them to you directly. They aren't printed in textbooks or announced at milestones. Instead, they're absorbed, quietly, repeatedly, through the rhythms of daily life. You arrive in the world as an open field. There's no judgment yet, no structure, no inherited meaning. But from your earliest days, that field is seeded by the voices around you, the norms you observe, the reactions you learn to anticipate. You notice which behaviors earn approval and which ones bring discomfort, not always through words, but through gestures, a nod, a frown, a long silence after you say something that doesn't quite fit. You don't analyze these moments, you simply absorb their emotional weight. And slowly, without being told, you begin to align. That's how the scripts are implanted, through repetition, emotion, and subtle reinforcement. Think back to school, not just the curriculum, but the atmosphere. What did it teach you about success, about failure? Were you encouraged to explore ideas, or to memorize and repeat? A child who learns that being wrong brings shame quickly forms a script. It's safer to stay silent than to risk being wrong. Another might internalize, achievement earns love, rest is laziness. These lessons don't need to be spoken aloud. In fact, they're often more powerful when they're not. Because unspoken rules create deeper obedience. They're absorbed without resistance. Media plays its role, too. We grow up watching characters who look a certain way, act a certain way, succeed in certain ways. And when those patterns are repeated endlessly, they stop feeling like fiction. They become cultural truth. Even peers contribute. As children, we learn quickly where the boundaries are, what's cool, what's weird, what's allowed. And while some of these limits are harmless, others begin to shape our identity in ways we don't fully understand. A boy who loves poetry might hide his notebooks because it doesn't fit the mold. A girl who asks too many questions might learn to stay quiet to be liked. These scripts aren't imposed by force. They're whispered through habit, social cues, and the desire to belong. And that's what makes them so powerful. Because belonging is survival. As children, we'll trade almost anything to belong, even our authenticity. And so, the scripts settle in. Not because we're weak, but because we're human. Because we all want to be accepted, seen, and safe. And in the process of adapting, we begin to forget what we traded away. Years later, we might struggle to express ourselves honestly, not realizing that we once learned honesty came with a cost. We might feel stuck in roles we didn't choose, unaware that we agreed to them long ago, without understanding what we were signing. That's why recognizing these implants is so disorienting, because they're not just beliefs, they're parts of us, and pulling on them can feel like unraveling something fundamental. But that unraveling is necessary, because underneath the inherited story lies a quieter truth, your own voice, your own values, your own way of seeing the world. The question is, are you willing to listen? even if it means letting go of what once kept you safe. Because only then can we begin to reclaim a self that existed before the scripting began. Now that we know how these invisible beliefs take root, it's time to look at what they cost us and why so many people live their entire lives without ever realizing they were following someone else's plan. It's easy to underestimate the damage these invisible scripts can cause, because on the surface, everything might look perfectly fine. You might have the job, the partner, the apartment. You check the boxes that society hands you, one by one. But beneath that carefully arranged life, something feels off. And that dissonance, the subtle ache you can't name, is often the first sign that you're living a life authored by someone else. When we live unconsciously, following scripts we never chose, we lose access to something essential, our inner compass. We stop asking what we want, because we've already been told what we should want. And slowly, the gap between the life we have and the life we actually need begins to widen. At first, the signs are quiet. You feel restless on Sunday nights. You scroll endlessly but don't know what you're looking for. You succeed but don't feel proud. You smile but feel flat inside. You might tell yourself this is normal, that everyone feels this way, but what you're actually experiencing is the weight of misalignment. You're living by a map that doesn't lead to your truth, and your soul is quietly trying to get your attention. Sometimes, the cost is emotional, chronic anxiety, burnout, or a creeping sense of emptiness. Other times, it shows up in relationships, when you realize you're surrounded by people who know the version of you that fits the script, but not the real you beneath it. You become an actor in your own life, performing stability, performing success, but wondering, late at night, why the role feels hollow. And then there are the bigger costs. Years go by. Dreams that once whispered to you begin to fade, not because they weren't real, but because you were too busy proving yourself to an audience that didn't even know you were performing. You become excellent at things you don't care about, reliable but uninspired, visible but unseen. This isn't a dramatic collapse, it's a slow erosion, 1,000 tiny compromises that wear down your sense of self until you no longer remember what's yours and what was inherited. And the tragedy is, you might never notice, because the world often rewards the script. You'll get praise, promotions, applause, but no one will ask if it feels true. No one but you. And that's the quiet heartbreak of unconscious living. You build a life that impresses everyone, except the one person it was meant to fulfill. But awareness, even when painful, is a gift. Because once you recognize the cost of living by default, you gain the power to begin again, deliberately. You can stop chasing someone else's idea of meaning and start listening to what's been waiting beneath the noise. Of course, that path isn't easy. Leaving the script often means disappointing people, losing certainty, stepping into unfamiliar territory. But what you lose in approval, you begin to gain in clarity, and eventually in peace, because nothing is heavier than a life that isn't yours. But nothing is more freeing than beginning to write your own. Now that we've seen the price of unconscious living, the next question becomes, how do we begin to break free? Not all at once, but gently, deliberately, and with enough courage to question what once felt unquestionable. Let's explore that next. And maybe the hardest part isn't the cost itself, but how quietly it accumulates. No crash, no warning, just a slow drifting away from yourself. Until one day you wake up in a life that looks nothing like the one you would have chosen if you'd felt free. And yet, because it happened in such small steps, it's hard to find where it all began. That's what makes invisible scripts so dangerous, not just their control, but their subtlety. They don't scream, they whisper. And unless you're listening carefully, you might mistake their voice for your own. Recognizing that you've been living according to someone else's script can feel like waking up mid-scene in a play you never auditioned for, aware at last, but still surrounded by props, costumes, and roles that no longer feel like yours. But awareness, though essential, is only the threshold. To truly step out of the loop, you must begin the far more subtle work of untangling. And unlike the drama we sometimes imagine, leaving a job, confronting a parent, reinventing an entire life, this process, at its most honest, often begins in moments so quiet they almost go unnoticed. It begins when you hear the old thought, "I should say yes to be polite," and instead of obeying automatically, you pause, not to rebel, not to prove anything, but simply to ask, "Is this actually mine?" That pause, that gentle interruption of the pattern, is everything. Because the loop doesn't feed on logic. It survives on repetition, and the smallest act of noticing can disrupt years of unconscious agreement. Escaping the loop doesn't mean erasing your past or rejecting everything you've been taught. It means developing the courage to stay with the discomfort of not knowing, of standing at the edge of what used to be automatic and choosing to stay awake. It means learning how to tolerate the silence that follows when you no longer perform for approval, and sitting with the awkwardness that arises when you stop answering to a script and start listening for your own voice. This process isn't loud. It's not marked by radical declarations or sweeping changes. Instead, it unfolds in tiny, deliberate acts, turning down a familiar opportunity that no longer aligns. Choosing to rest without justifying it. Telling the truth, even when your voice trembles. And most of all, noticing the parts of yourself that still seek permission and gently reminding them they don't need it anymore. You won't get it right every time. Old patterns are seductive, especially when you're tired or afraid. And there will be days when you slide back into performance, into roles that feel safer than the uncertainty of authenticity. But the difference now is that you'll notice, and each time you return to yourself, no matter how quietly, you reinforce a new rhythm. Not a script imposed from the outside, but a language that emerges from within. It helps, too, to create an environment that supports this repatterning, not just aesthetically, but energetically. Surround yourself with people who don't need you to be the old version of you. Make space for silence, even if it feels strange at first. Let your surroundings reflect the life you're now writing, slowly, carefully, truthfully. And above all, offer yourself the patience you were never taught to give, because what you're doing isn't small. You're not just breaking habits, you're grieving identities. You're shedding layers that once protected you, even as they confined you. There's no clear ending to this process, no final moment when you arrive at the fully unscripted self. But what does change is your capacity to return, to notice the drift, to interrupt the pattern, and to choose, again and again, what feels real. This is not about perfection, it's about practice. A living commitment to stay close to what's true, even when it's unfamiliar, even when it's hard. And with time, something unexpected begins to emerge. Not just clarity, but peace. Not the peace that comes from certainty, but the kind that arises when you are finally aligned with yourself, with your choices, with the life you're slowly, quietly reclaiming. Let's turn now to what that new way of being might actually feel like. There comes a point in this journey, not marked by fireworks or grand transformation, when the noise begins to settle. You find yourself less interested in proving, less entangled in performance, and more attuned to something quieter, something deeper, awareness. Not the kind that arrives with urgency, fueled by fear or frustration, but the slow, steady presence of being truly awake to your own life. At first, this awareness feels almost imperceptible. You still wake up in the same bed, speak to the same people, perform the same daily rituals, but beneath the surface, something subtle has shifted. You are paying attention. You notice when you begin to shrink in a conversation, when you laugh a little too quickly to smooth discomfort, or when you consider saying yes out of habit rather than desire. And while you may still fall into those patterns, because you're human, each moment of noticing becomes a thread. Pulled gently, it begins to unravel the old script. And in that unraveling, a strange kind of softness emerges, not weakness, but depth. You no longer rush to fix every uncertainty or define every feeling. You begin to trust that your truth, even when quiet or incomplete, is still worth listening to. This new awareness doesn't come with a checklist or a timeline. It can't be optimized or monetized. It unfolds at its own pace, often inconveniently, often without external validation. And yet, it's more sustaining than anything that came before, because it's yours. For perhaps the first time, you begin to act not from obligation, but from alignment. You say no and feel your body relax. Instead of tighten, you pause in a moment of conflict, not to win, but to understand. You sit with discomfort, not because you enjoy it, but because you no longer fear what it might reveal. The people around you may notice something different. They might not have the language for it, but they'll feel it, that you're no longer performing, that your words carry a different weight, not louder, but more grounded, that your presence, once shaped by approval, now feels anchored in something internal. And perhaps most surprisingly, this shift doesn't isolate you. It connects you more deeply. Because when you live with integrity, when your outer life begins to reflect your inner truth, you invite others to do the same, not through advice, not through preaching, but simply by being. You become an example of what it looks like to live unscripted, not perfectly, not always clearly, but honestly. And while this kind of life may not impress everyone, it will nourish the relationships that matter. It will create space for conversations you've longed to have. It will quiet the exhaustion that comes from pretending. Most importantly, it will return you to yourself. Not a version of you molded by expectation or fear, but the one who existed before the performance began. The one who still remembers how to listen without noise, how to choose without guilt, how to live without needing permission. This awareness is not a destination, it's a practice, one that begins with noticing and deepens every time you return. And so the journey doesn't end here, not with this video, not with any revelation. It continues, moment by moment, as you step more fully into the life that's been waiting behind the script. Let's close now with one final reflection, an invitation, not to act, but to notice. And maybe what's most profound isn't the clarity itself, but the quiet confidence that begins to grow alongside it. You no longer need to explain every decision or justify every change. You simply start living in a way that feels congruent with your inner knowing, sometimes softly, sometimes imperfectly, but always truthfully. There will still be days when the old scripts resurface, when you catch yourself reaching for performance, approval, or certainty. But now, instead of falling fully back into them, you pause, you breathe, and you remember. You have a choice now. That's the essence of this new kind of awareness. It isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to stay in the questions, without rushing to fill the silence with someone else's truth. You might find yourself more sensitive to noise that used to go unnoticed, the subtle manipulation in a conversation, the pressure in an achievement-driven culture, the tension in saying yes when your whole body whispers no. And instead of tolerating those things, you begin to gently step away. Not out of judgment, but out of self-respect. Because once you've tasted what it feels like to be fully present with yourself, to live from alignment rather than reaction, it becomes harder and harder to abandon that feeling. And though the world may still offer scripts, roles, and masks, you start to see them for what they are. Suggestions, not commandments. You're no longer a character inside someone else's story. You're learning, at last, how to write your own. So much of what we call growth is really just remembering who we were before the world told us who to be. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need a 5-year plan. You just need to begin listening, gently, curiously, to the quiet voice beneath the noise. And when something no longer fits, you don't have to force it to. You simply notice, and let that noticing become a doorway back to yourself. If this video helped you see something more clearly or feel something more deeply, consider subscribing. Not because you need more content, but because sometimes the right reminder arrives at exactly the right time. And if you tap the bell, you'll know when it does. More importantly, if someone in your life is living a story they never chose, working, loving, or striving in a way that doesn't feel like theirs, share this with them, not to convince, but to remind that it's okay to question, it's okay to pause, and it's more than okay to begin again. Not louder, not faster, just more honestly.